The species that chose to be kind. For 160 years, the galaxy had called humanity the Menders. It was not a title anyone had voted on or formally declared. It had grown the way true things grow, slowly, organically, out of 10,000 small observations made by 10,000 different species across 100 different worlds. You saw a human medical frigate arrive at a dying colony, and you called it what it was. You watched a human engineer stay awake for 4 days, repairing a water reclamation system on a planet that wasn't hers, for people she had never met, and you understood. You saw a human diplomat sit in a room of screaming, spitting, claw-rattling aliens for 11 hours without raising his voice, and you thought, these creatures are something else. The galaxy had many words for what humans were, but Menders was the one that stuck. It had all started with the joining, the moment humanity first made contact with the Galactic Assembly, a coalition of 387 spacefaring civilizations bound together by shared law, shared trade, and a shared exhaustion with war. Humanity had come to the assembly table with something no predator species had ever offered before. They had come with their weapons already set aside. Not surrendered, not destroyed. Set aside. Voluntarily. Freely. The Assembly's elder species had watched this with something between wonder and confusion. The Keth, whose empire had been built on 8,000 years of conquest, could not understand it. The Draavek, whose biology made them constitutionally aggressive, had studied humanity's history in private and come away deeply unsettled. A species with that past, choosing this? It made no sense. But humans had looked at the galaxy, its wars, its cycles of retaliation, its civilizations ground to dust by pride, and decided they wanted something different. So they put their weapons in deep storage and picked up stethoscopes and bridge blueprints and negotiation manuals instead. For 160 years, it had worked. Ambassador Dara Osei sat in the gallery of the Assembly's Grand Convocation Hall on the station world of Veilun Crossing, watching 3 species argue about ore rights, and thought, I have aged here, in this room, arguing about ore. She was 67 years old. Her hair, once dark and close-cropped, had gone the color of dry ash at the roots. Her face held the particular geography of someone who had laughed hard and often and slept only when forced to. She wore the Assembly's standard diplomatic dress, slate gray, immaculately pressed, with a single copper clasp at her collar. The emblem bore the shape of 2 hands open and facing upward. It was the emblem of Earth's diplomatic mission. She had worn it 23 years. In those 23 years, she had brokered the Halessi Accord, ending a border war between the Telvanni and the Gur that had burned for 4 centuries. She had negotiated food relief into the Durrani cluster after a crop blight wiped out 6 harvests in a row. She once spent 17 hours in a pressurized chamber with a Keth military commander who had been about to bombard a civilian outpost, listening to the commander talk about her dead sister until the rage that had been driving her finally exhausted itself and the order was never given. That was what humans did. They listened until the other person was empty of everything that could cause harm. Then they helped fill them back up with something better. The galaxy, on the whole, appreciated this about humanity. But appreciation and respect were not the same thing, and respect and fear were even further apart. Dara noticed it the way you notice a slow leak in small things first, the way assembly delegates smiled at human representatives like adults humoring precocious children, the way military species like the Keth and the Voron laughed quietly in corridors about human softness, the way some civilizations treated humanity's voluntary disarmament not as the remarkable act of self-discipline it was, but as evidence that humans simply weren't dangerous enough to bother with. It bothered her. She had spent a career building something fragile and real, and it bothered her that others could not see its value.
but she never let it show. She was showing it now, though, on the inside, where no one could see, because of a report she had received 4 days ago from Sujin Pelhari, an intelligence analyst from the Thilin Collective. The Thilins were the galaxy's watchers. Compound-eyed, patient, they observed everything and disclosed only what mattered. When a Thilin brought you a report unsolicited, you did not question whether to read it. Pelhari had told her that the Draavek Sovereignty was moving ships. Not patrol ships, not trade escorts, warships, troop carriers, deep-range bombardment platforms, the kind of fleet you assemble when you intend to take something and don't plan to give it back. The Draavek were not members of the Galactic Assembly. They were a reptilian empire that lived at the edge of mapped space and ruled by demonstrating, periodically, what happened to people who forgot to be afraid of them. For decades, they had tested assembly borders, raided fringe settlements, disappeared the occasional colony ship. The Assembly's standard response had always been negotiations, concessions, strongly worded communiques, and quiet prayers that the Draavek would find someone else to bother. Dara had a specific fear. It had coordinates. Caravan's Landing. A human colony world settled 112 years ago. A world of warm, shallow seas and enormous amber skies, where the sunsets lasted 3 hours and the people had built something slow and good and very human. 2.7 million people lived there. Farmers, teachers, doctors, craftspeople. Children who had never seen Earth but called themselves human with the unqualified confidence of people who understood that humanity was a choice, not a geography. It was also 11 light minutes from the Draavek border, and it had no defenses whatsoever, because the Assembly's treaty with humanity said that human worlds didn't need weapons because the Assembly would protect them, because that was the agreement.
Dara stood before the Assembly that same afternoon and presented the intelligence in a clear, level voice. She showed the fleet movement data. She displayed the projected trajectories. She requested a defensive patrol in the Caravan sector. The Draavek's observer delegation called it human anxiety disorder. The Varan Military Council said their own analysts found no credible threat. The Halani trade minister worried that moving ships would provoke an incident and complicate an ongoing resource negotiation. The motion failed. As the delegates filed out around her, Pelhari paused at her shoulder. The Thilin's compound eyes caught the light of the dying star that shone through the hall's crystal walls. "I believe you are correct," Pelhari said, very quietly. "Then why didn't your delegation support the motion?" Dara asked. Pelhari was silent for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "The Assembly has survived 4,000 years by flinching away from confrontation. It does not know how to do otherwise." A pause. "It may be about to learn." Pelhari left. Dara stood alone in the grand hall while the amber light shifted around her. She thought about Caravan's Landing. She thought about 2.7 million people who believed they were safe. She thought about a promise the Assembly had made and the silence that kept getting where courage should have been. That night, she sent a message to the colony's administrator, an old colleague named Rosabelle Mwangi. She told her, very carefully, to quietly review emergency shelter capacity, just as a precaution. Rosabelle wrote back, "You worry more than anyone I know. Come visit, and I'll remind you what peace looks like." 26 days later, 180 Draavek warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Caravan's Landing with their weapons already charged. There was nothing in orbit to meet them. Not a single gun, not a single ship, just 2.7 million people and the vast amber sky they loved and the sudden terrible darkness that moved across it like a hand closing. What burning looks like from the ground. Physician Tomas Ferreira was in the middle of his morning rounds when the world ended. He was 41 years old,
broad-shouldered, with the particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from decades of learning to keep it below the surface. He had come to Caravan's Landing 6 years ago to lead the trauma unit at New Corobal's Regional Medical Center. He liked the amber sunsets. He liked the shallow sea that was visible from the hospital's east wing on clear mornings. He liked the way the colony felt like something being built with patience and intent. He was reading a child's chart when the first impact hit and the windows blew in. The sound was wrong, not like an explosion in any recording he had ever seen, but something deeper, something that lived below the frequency of human hearing and still communicated unmistakably that the world had changed. The floor shook, the lights died, and the emergency systems caught them a second later, flooding the ward with flat white light. Then the sirens. He ran to the window. The sky above New Corobal was full of ships, dark, angular, enormous, hanging in the atmosphere like the architecture of a nightmare. Draavek markings in red and black, which he recognized from history files he read without urgency, because history files were for other people's problems. They weren't other people's problems now. From the bellies of those ships, fire was falling. Not explosive ordnance in any conventional sense, something worse, atmospheric thermal weapons that turned the air into a medium for heat, that made the burning happen in the space between things rather than at a point of impact. Entire blocks of New Corobal ignited at once. The residential district to the north simply stopped existing. The fire didn't spread across it. It arrived everywhere simultaneously, and the structures came apart from the inside. Tomas stepped back from the window and returned to work. This was not bravery. It was simpler than bravery. People were hurt. He could help. The rest of the calculation was not one he had room to make. He activated his neural recorder, a medical-grade implant he wore for documentation purposes, intake, diagnostic logging. Some reflex he set it to continuous broadcast mode, rather than local storage. He would not understand why he had done this until much later, and by then the reason would be beyond him to articulate. Something old and deep had made that choice, something that knew what testimony was worth. For the next 12 hours, Tomas Ferreira moved through the burning city of New Corobal and did the thing he had trained to do.
The silence before the storm. Humanity went quiet for 3 days. It was not the quiet of grief, though grief was certainly present. It was something else. The quality of silence you find in the moment before a decision, when everything that was is being held against everything that could be, and the scales are being read very carefully by people who understand that what they choose next will not be undone. Human embassies across 100 worlds closed their doors. Human ships held position in port. The Earth diplomatic mission on Velun Crossing put a single handwritten notice on its door. Closed. We will contact you when we have something to say. The galaxy assumed it was morning. Species that had watched humanity for 160 years assumed that what came next would be a speech, a plea, a request for justice, perhaps an appeal for the Assembly to take stronger action. Humans talked. Humans believed in words. Humans always came back to the negotiating table because that was the shape of them. Patient, persistent, oriented toward resolution even when resolution seemed impossible. The Draavek Supreme Commander, a scarred veteran named Grauvenask, gave a public statement in which he described the attack on Caravan's Landing as a territorial clarification and expressed no regret. When a journalist asked whether he feared human retaliation, he made a sound his species used for contempt. "What will they do?" he said. "They haven't held a weapon in 2 generations. They'll write resolutions at us." On the assembly floor, a session was convened. Every species attended. The hall was full of the particular energy of powerful beings who have witnessed something terrible and are now urgently performing concern. A resolution was drafted. It expressed deep dismay. It called for an explanation from the Draavek. It noted with sorrow the significant loss of life. It suggested, in careful diplomatic language, that such actions were not consistent with the standards of civilized conduct. No one proposed military response. No one proposed sanctions with teeth. Two delegates suggested in whispers that carried further than they intended that the proximity of the colony to the Draavek border perhaps represented a kind of provocation, that the tragedy, while certainly lamentable, might have been foreseen. Ambassador Dara Osei sat through the entire session. She did not speak. She sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and listened to 387 species deliberate about the murder of 2.7 million of her people, the way a board of directors discusses a problematic quarterly report. When the session closed, she stood. The hall went still. Every sensor cluster and optical organ and auditory apparatus in the room oriented toward her. They were waiting for the human response, the careful, measured diplomatic words, the appeal to shared values, the request for unity. Dara reached up and removed the copper clasp from her collar, the one with two open hands. She had worn it for 23 years. She set it on the desk in front of her. The sound it made, copper on wood, barely audible in that vast hall, landed like a struck bell. She turned and walked out. She did not look back. The doors of the convocation hall closed behind her. Across the known galaxy, humanity watched this in silence. Then they convened their own session. The United Earth Parliament met in closed emergency assembly. Every representative from every nation, every orbital station, every colony world in human space. No observers, no press, no alien representatives. The session lasted 9 hours. The vote was unanimous. Not a working majority, not a supermajority. Every single representative from every culture and political tradition in humanity's sprawling, fractious, perpetually arguing civilization voted the same way. Historians who studied it later called it the most unified moment in human political history, which was both remarkable and sobering, because what unified humanity had never before been able to achieve was a decision to stop being what it had chosen to be. When the session ended, a single transmission was prepared. It was loaded on every communications array humanity controlled, every satellite, every relay station, every deep space beacon. It broadcast on every frequency the galaxy used: diplomatic, commercial, emergency, military, and 7 frequencies that no one had known humanity possessed. The woman who delivered it was Assembly Speaker Amara Johansson Kite. She was 61 years old, small, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that gave nothing away for free. She had been a constitutional scholar before politics. She had never raised her voice in 20 years of public life. She stood in a plain room. No decoration, no prepared notes. She wore black. She spoke.
He carried 11 children out of a collapsed learning center, small, ash-covered, some of them quiet in the specific way that means a child has gone somewhere inside themselves where sound cannot reach. He set bones with improvised splints. He performed 2 emergency surgeries on a floor that had once been someone's kitchen, with instruments that were too few and a light that was too dim, and hands he kept forcing steady by will alone. He held a man's hand while that man died, and said things that were not lies, but were not quite the full truth either, because the full truth would not have helped. He rationed water. He moved his growing group of survivors deeper into the building as the perimeter collapsed. He told stories to the children when the impacts shook dust from the ceiling, not because stories would help, but because the sound of a calm voice doing something ordinary was the closest thing to safety he could offer. In the 4th hour, the Draavek ground forces arrived. He saw them through the narrow window of what had been a storage room, heavy transports that moved through the debris-filled streets with indifference, crushing whatever was underneath. The soldiers who disembarked were tall, armored in black and red, and they moved through the city with the unhurried efficiency of predators on a landscape they have already decided belongs to them. They were shooting people. Not soldiers. There were no soldiers. Caravan's Landing had no garrison, no armed police, no weapons of any kind beyond kitchen tools and agricultural equipment. The Draavek were shooting farmers, shopkeepers, an elderly woman who appeared to have sat down in the middle of the street and could not or would not get up. A man carrying 2 children, running, who made it most of the way across an intersection before he didn't. Some of the soldiers were making sounds that Tomas's translation implant rendered as laughter. A transmission went out across every active channel, every screen, every speaker, every device that still functioned anywhere on Caravan's Landing. The Draavek commander's voice was deep, satisfied, and utterly without doubt. Let the soft ones be the lesson the galaxy needed. What cannot defend itself does not deserve to keep what it has. Tomas kept recording, kept working. By hour 8, evacuation shuttles began launching from the colony's spaceport at the edge of the city. He watched the feeds on his implant, vehicles packed with civilians rising into the smoke-darkened sky, climbing toward the slim hope of orbit and escape. The Draavek warships shot them down one by one. Each flash was hundreds of people. They fell back through the atmosphere trailing fire and struck the ground and were gone. By hour 11, Tomas knew the building had been found. He could hear movement above him, the methodical sound of search, the crash of doors. He could hear other sounds, too, which he did not process fully, because processing them fully would have made it impossible to keep functioning. He gathered the people with him, behind him, in the narrow corridor of the basement. 53 survivors, 30 of them children. He had no weapon. A surgical tool in his coat pocket, which he did not reach for because reaching for it would accomplish nothing, and he preferred to spend his last moments not performing a futile gesture. He looked into his neural implant's interface. 11 hours, 40 minutes of continuous recording. Everything, every child's face, every soldier's laugh, the sky full of ships, the shuttles that rose and fell, the street where the running man had not made it across. He opened the Galactic Assembly's emergency broadcast frequency, the one monitored by every civilized species, every ship, every station in known space. He uploaded everything. 11 hours, 40 minutes. Then he looked into the recorder and spoke. His voice was steady. His hands, finally, were still. My name is Dr. Tomas Ferreira. I am a trauma physician on Caravan's Landing. For the last 11 hours, I have been trying to keep people alive while the Draavek Sovereignty kills everyone around me. I am transmitting this so that the galaxy will be able to know it didn't know. Please bear witness. We could not choose otherwise. The door above him broke open. The recording transmitted. Across the known galaxy, there was 11 hours, 40 minutes of footage that no one who watched it would ever fully set down.
To the species of the Galactic Assembly, to the Draavek Sovereignty, to all who are listening. She paused, just long enough. For 160 years, humanity chose to be something better than what we were. We set aside weapons that we had built and could have used.
We healed the sick and built the bridges and stayed in the rooms where people were screaming and waited for the screaming to become something we could work with. We buried the part of ourselves that your historians never bothered to look at, because we believed the galaxy deserved better than what we were capable of. You saw this as softness. You let our children burn. We came to you with evidence. We asked for protection. You voted against us. When 2.7 million of our people were killed on a world we were promised would be safe, you offered language, diplomatic censure, deep dismay. You debated in whispers loud enough to hear whether it was our fault for living so close to the things that killed us. We heard you. We understood. Effective immediately, all demilitarization agreements between humanity and the Galactic Assembly are dissolved. All voluntary disarmament accords are rescinded. All diplomatic conventions are suspended pending review. The vaults are open. We have a particular message for the Draavek Sovereignty. You wanted to teach the galaxy something about what humanity is. We will help you with that. We are no longer what we chose to be. We are what we were born as. Start counting. The transmission ended. Across the galaxy there was a silence of a very specific kind. The silence of species that have just realized they had been misreading something for a very long time. Pelhari, the Thillan intelligence analyst, was asked to brief the Assembly's inner council within the hour. She stood in a small chamber with 11 of the galaxy's most powerful political figures and delivered a report that none of them were going to enjoy. "We made an error," she said. "We interpreted humanity's peace as the behavior of a species that was not dangerous. It was the behavior of a species that was extremely dangerous and was trying very hard not to be." She presented the data, human history, the real depth of it, the parts that humanity had quietly not advertised, the planetary scale wars, the nuclear arsenals enough to destroy their own world several times over, which they had pointed at each other for decades before stepping back from the edge. The pattern of organized violence so persistent that humanity had developed a specific vocabulary for the intentional elimination of entire peoples, because such things needed names in their languages. The biological and environmental warfare research. The centuries of continuous military development, even during periods nominally defined as peace. And the biological data. Human reflexes in the 93rd percentile of known species. Persistence endurance unmatched in the galaxy. A healing factor that outperformed most armored species. The ability to operate cognitively under stress conditions that would incapacitate most sentient beings. Evolved as pursuit predators, creatures that did not simply kill prey, but followed it patiently over vast distances until it had nothing left to give. They didn't disarm because they were harmless. They disarmed because they knew exactly what they were, and it frightened them. No one in the chamber said anything for a long time. Grauven Osk, the Draavek Supreme Commander, watched the human transmission with his command staff. He laughed. His officers laughed. He poured a drink and predicted that the humans would come with their old weapons and their unpracticed soldiers and break like anything else that had forgotten what war cost. In the corner of the room, his youngest intelligence analyst, a junior officer named Keseveth Ra, was not laughing. She had spent the last 3 hours reading human history files. She had reached the section on the First and Second World Wars and had not been able to continue. Her hands were trembling. She wanted to stand up and say, "You are making the worst mistake our civilization has ever made." They were not peaceful because they were weak.
They were peaceful because they were afraid of what they would do if they stopped.
She said nothing. The Draavek military hierarchy did not tolerate contradiction from junior officers. She would be dead in 89 days, along with everyone else in that room. On Earth, beneath a mountain range that had once been called the Andes, doors that had not opened in 160 years began to move. The sound of them was enormous, old hinges the size of buildings, rust breaking in sheets, the mechanical groan of something that had been waiting with infinite patience for a day that everyone had hoped would never come. Lights flickered on in tunnels that ran for kilometers in every direction. Automated systems that had been quietly maintaining readiness for 160 years without ever being asked to, reported, "All systems nominal, awaiting authorization." The authorization came. Inside, at the very deepest level, behind a door marked with a single word, Orin, a file began uploading to every human military network in existence. It was called the Orin Doctrine. It had been written 60 years ago by a group of military theorists who then sealed it away and collectively agreed they hoped it would never be needed. It was a complete theoretical framework for the application of human military capacity in asymmetric and conventional warfare. The people who wrote it had been very good at their work. Humanity had spent 160 years learning to be healers. It took them 72 hours to remember what they had been before. The galaxy chose to see what mercy looked like when it was taken for weakness. Now it was about to learn what mercy looked like when it was chosen deliberately by something that no longer had to choose it. And that difference between peace as innocence and peace as restraint was the most terrifying thing in the known universe. Part 4. What we were before we tried to be better. The galaxy expected a war to take years to begin. This was reasonable. Every civilization with a military knew that mobilization was the longest part. You needed shipyards, supply chains, trained crews, command structures, coordination between production and logistics and deployment. The Keth, who held the assembly record for rapid military buildup, had once assembled a strike fleet in 4 years and been celebrated for their speed. Humanity did it in 22 days. The first sign came from the asteroid belt in the outer edge of human-controlled space. Long-range sensors operated by a Dravari trade consortium detected massive construction signatures where their charts showed only uninhabited rock. When they resolved their telescopes to maximum focus, they found shipyards, enormous automated construction platforms, each one the size of a small city, building warships from blueprints being transmitted in real time from somewhere inside the Sol system. The platforms were not new. They had been there for decades, housed inside hollowed-out asteroids, maintained by automated systems, doing nothing visible, waiting. The Galactic Assembly's intelligence services held a collective emergency review and came to a single, simultaneous, deeply uncomfortable understanding. Humanity had never stopped designing weapons, not in 160 years of peace. In facilities that no one had looked for because no one had thought to look, human engineers and military scientists had continued their work, quietly, systematically, improving on what was stored in the vaults, imagining what came next, ensuring that the day the vaults opened, what came out would not be outdated. They had hoped they were building things they would never use. They built them anyway. Fleet Admiral Yara Svensson Diallo stood on the command deck of the HSS Reckoning, the flagship of the 1st Retribution Battle Group, and looked at the tactical display with the eyes of someone who has already decided that whatever needs doing will be done cleanly and without hesitation. She was 54 years old, lean, composed, with gray at her temples, and a way of standing that made the room orient to her without her asking. She had a son named Baron. He was 8 years old, and he lived on Caravan's Landing with his other mother, and he loved the amber sunsets there. She had a recording of him on her personal device.
She had not watched it since the attack. She would not watch it again until this was over. When her officers gathered for the initial briefing, she did not speak about justice or grief or purpose. She projected a tactical map of Draavek sovereign space, indicated the positions of their border fleet, and said, "We begin here." Questions? There were no questions. The Assembly sent communications demanding that humanity stand down. They invoked treaties, they cited regulations, they warned of consequences. Speaker Johansen Kite's response was 5 sentences. "You had your chance to act. We chose language. We choose action. This is not your concern. Do not contact us on this matter again." 3 Assembly species offered to mediate. Johansen Kite declined. 2 species threatened trade sanctions. Johansen Kite responded with a single question. Before implementing those sanctions, how many of their life support systems, communication networks, and food distribution programs were built and are currently maintained by human engineers? The sanctions were quietly set aside. The first Retribution battle group jumped to the Draavek border on a day that would later be given a name in 17 different languages, all of which translated to some version of the day the quiet ended. It was not a large fleet by conventional galactic metrics, 49 warships. The Draavek had 260 guarding their border, under the command of a veteran named Vrethkar Osin, who had won campaigns against 4 different species and never lost an engagement he was aware of. He looked at the human fleet on his sensors with what his species would recognize as relaxed contempt. The battle lasted 7 hours.
When it ended, every Draavek border ship was either destroyed or disabled. Humanity had lost 3 vessels. Military analysts from a dozen species spent weeks reviewing the engagement data and came away shaken in a way that was difficult to fully communicate. The humans had not fought the way any other species fought. There were no formation tactics, no predictable patterns, no strategic templates that could be cross-referenced against known doctrine. Every ship seemed to operate with full individual initiative and yet somehow in perfect coordination, as if 49 separate minds were sharing a single intention. Their strategies changed mid-engagement, mid-minute, sometimes mid-exchange, adapting faster than opposing commanders could model. They had hacked Draavek communication systems and fed false orders back through the enemy's own network, turning border ships against each other. They used weapons that the Assembly's database had no classification for. They moved in formations that seemed to violate conventional tactical sense and then delivered outcomes that made the logic apparent only in retrospect. A Keth military commander, reviewing the data with professional respect, said something that traveled across the galaxy in the way true things travel. Other species study war as a discipline. For humans, it is a reflex. They did not need to relearn it. They needed to permit themselves to remember it. Grauvanausk was no longer laughing. He sent a communication requesting negotiation. He used careful diplomatic language. He suggested a ceasefire. He implied that terms could be discussed in good faith. Admiral Svensson Diallo read the message once. She sent back a single file, Dr. Tomas Ferreira's neural recording, 11 hours, 40 minutes of footage. Everything. The children in the rubble, the man who didn't make it across the street, the laughter of soldiers, the shuttles falling from the sky like burning leaves. No words, no terms, nothing else. The first Retribution battle group crossed into Draavek Sovereignty the following morning. What followed was not a war in the way wars are usually understood. It was more like a demonstration of the difference between rage and precision. Rage burns everything. Precision burns only what needs to burn. Humanity destroyed every military installation in Draavek space, every shipyard, every weapons production facility, every orbital defense platform, every military communications array, every troop staging ground.
They moved through the Draavek Sovereignty like surgeons excising something dangerous, leaving the healthy tissue completely intact. Cities were untouched, farms continued to grow, water systems and power grids were left running. Civilian infrastructure was not a target, not a consideration, not even a temptation. Only what had a gun was removed from the universe. The precision was what terrified the watching galaxy most. A species acting from pure vengeance would have made the Draavek worlds look like Caravan's Landing. That would have been understandable. Awful, but understandable. Rage is at least a known quantity. This was not rage. This was something colder and more controlled, and ultimately more frightening, because it showed a level of self-mastery that implied the violence was always available and always chosen. They could have burned everything. They burned only what needed burning. The restraint was not weakness. It was the most explicit possible demonstration that the capacity for destruction was being directed rather than consumed. The Assembly watched. Calculations were made in every military ministry on every world. If humanity could do this to the Draavek Sovereignty in weeks, what did the known galaxy actually look like now? Old alliances shifted. Some species quietly offered resources and support. Others reinforced their own borders and said nothing. The Keth, who had laughed in corridors about human softness, quietly began reviewing everything they thought they knew about their own strategic position. Palhari presented a second briefing to the Assembly's inner council. Her voice, always measured, carried something unfamiliar in it. "The Draavek Sovereignty will fall," she said. "This is now certain. The question the Assembly must ask is not whether humanity will win, it is what humanity will want when they are finished." The council chamber was very quiet. No one had an answer.
What the healers did with the sword. The Draavek Sovereignty fell on the 89th day, not in an explosion, not in a final dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet way that systems fail when everything that held them together has been methodically and precisely removed. The last military units surrendered after their command network went dark. The civilian government, such as it was, broadcast a formal capitulation at 0400 local time on a world that was still standing, still lit, still fed, still whole in every way except the one way that Draavek had depended on most. Fleet Admiral Svensson Diallo was on the bridge of the reckoning when the message came through. She read it without visible reaction. "Weapons status?" she asked. "All orbital defenses neutralized. The planet is open." She looked at Draavek's world through the bridge viewport for a long time, a rust-colored world with vast canyon systems and gray-brown cities spread across its plains. 8 billion people below, children who had never made a tactical decision in their lives, families who had not chosen what their government chose, people who were at this moment looking up at the sky and understanding that whatever came next was entirely in the hands of the species they had helped destroy. Svensson Diallo thought about Baron. She thought about amber sunsets. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could give an order that would be obeyed without question, and what that meant about what kind of order you chose to give. "Ground forces only," she said. "Precision strikes on confirmed military targets. Secure the command infrastructure. Arrest the senior leadership. Any soldier who harms a non-combatant answers to me personally." Her officers obeyed without hesitation or surprise. They had expected nothing else. Human soldiers landed on Draavek's world in armored transports and moved through the capital city with weapons ready and restrained. Most Draavek military units had already surrendered. Those that hadn't were dealt with quickly. Grauven Osk was found in his war room, sitting at his desk, alone, staring at nothing. The celebratory drink from weeks ago was still on the table, unfinished. He looked at the human soldiers who came to arrest him and said nothing. His expression was unreadable, but his silence communicated something that might, in another species, be called understanding arriving too late.
Across the galaxy, every species that had a military was now running numbers. Humanity possessed the most powerful armed force in known space. The Draavek were broken. Every other major military was weaker by comparison. If humanity wanted to reshape the galaxy by force, the galaxy currently lacked the ability to prevent it. Speaker Johansen Kite addressed the galaxy for the second time. Same plain room, same black clothing. The weight of what the past months had cost her was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. Not weakness, but the particular gravity of someone who has made choices that cannot be unmade and has looked at them honestly and chosen to carry them. The Draavek Sovereignty's military capacity has been eliminated. Their leadership has been arrested and will face trial before a tribunal of species not involved in this conflict. Their civilian population has received and will continue to receive humanitarian aid. We did not come to exterminate. We came to make certain that what happened to Kiravan's landing cannot be done again. She paused. To the Galactic Assembly, we will not be rejoining your institution. We gave you our trust and the lives of our people, and you failed both. 2.7 million human beings died because the Assembly believed that a carefully worded statement was an adequate response to mass murder. We will not make that arrangement again. She paused again. When she continued, her voice carried something that was not anger and not grief, but occupied the space between them, where something true lives.
What the healers did with the sword. The Draavek Sovereignty fell on the 89th day, not in an explosion, not in a final dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet way that systems fail when everything that held them together has been methodically and precisely removed. The last military units surrendered after their command network went dark. The civilian government, such as it was, broadcast a formal capitulation at 0400 local time on a world that was still standing, still lit, still fed, still whole in every way except the one way that Draavek had depended on most. Fleet Admiral Svensson Diallo was on the bridge of the reckoning when the message came through. She read it without visible reaction. "Weapons status?" she asked. "All orbital defenses neutralized. The planet is open." She looked at Draavek's world through the bridge viewport for a long time, a rust-colored world with vast canyon systems and gray-brown cities spread across its plains. 8 billion people below. Children who had never made a tactical decision in their lives, families who had not chosen what their government chose, people who were at this moment looking up at the sky and understanding that whatever came next was entirely in the hands of the species they had helped destroy. Svensson Diallo thought about Baron. She thought about amber sunsets. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could give an order that would be obeyed without question, and what that meant about what kind of order you chose to give. "Ground forces only," she said. "Precision strikes on confirmed military targets. Secure the command infrastructure. Arrest the senior leadership. Any soldier who harms a non-combatant answers to me personally." Her officers obeyed without hesitation or surprise. They had expected nothing else. Human soldiers landed on Draavek's world in armored transports and moved through the capital city with weapons ready and restrained. Most Draavek military units had already surrendered. Those that hadn't were dealt with quickly. Grauven Osk was found in his war room, sitting at his desk, alone, staring at nothing. The celebratory drink from weeks ago was still on the table, unfinished. He looked at the human soldiers who came to arrest him and said nothing. His expression was unreadable, but his silence communicated something that might, in another species, be called understanding arriving too late. Across the galaxy, every species that had a military was now running numbers. Humanity possessed the most powerful armed force in known space. The Draavek were broken. Every other major military was weaker by comparison. If humanity wanted to reshape the galaxy by force, the galaxy currently lacked the ability to prevent it. Speaker Johansen Kite addressed the galaxy for the second time. Same plain room, same black clothing.
The weight of what the past months had cost her was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. Not weakness, but the particular gravity of someone who has made choices that cannot be unmade and has looked at them honestly and chosen to carry them. The Draavek Sovereignty's military capacity has been eliminated. Their leadership has been arrested and will face trial before a tribunal of species not involved in this conflict. Their civilian population has received and will continue to receive humanitarian aid. We did not come to exterminate. We came to make certain that what happened to Kiravan's landing cannot be done again. She paused. To the Galactic Assembly, we will not be rejoining your institution. We gave you our trust and the lives of our people, and you failed both. 2.7 million human beings died because the Assembly believed that a carefully worded statement was an adequate response to mass murder. We will not make that arrangement again. She paused again. When she continued, her voice carried something that was not anger and not grief, but occupied the space between them, where something true lives. A memorial was built where the medical center had stood. A garden, tended with the patient care of people who understand that growth is itself a kind of argument. At its center, a statue. A man kneeling, one arm holding a child, the other arm extended outward in the gesture of someone trying to shield something they know they cannot save. The face was calm. The eyes were open. The plaque at its base read, "Dr. Tomas Ferreira, trauma physician. He asked us not to look away. We did not." Dara Osi came to the memorial on the 10th anniversary of the massacre. She was 77 years old, and she walked with a cane, and the world she stepped onto was one she had known in messages and photographs and the testimony of people who had loved it. She had never been here before. She had not been able to come before now. She stood before the statue and placed white flowers at its base and did not speak. The garden was full of people, survivors, new settlers, delegates from assembly species who had come because coming felt necessary. And near the garden's eastern edge, watching with wide, uncertain eyes, stood a Draavek prole, perhaps 8 years old, part of the post-war generation, born after the sovereignty fell, brought here by parents who worked in the reconstruction effort. She did not know what this place had been. She knew only that the statue showed a man helping children, and that the old woman with the flowers looked like she carried something very heavy. Their eyes met. The Draavek child tilted her head in the way her species did when something did not fit their current map of things. Dara looked at her for a long moment. This child's civilization had killed everyone she had loved on this world, and here this child stood, in a garden grown from those ashes, innocent and alive, and confused by the universe's refusal to be simple. Dara smiled. It was not a simple smile. It was the kind that carries many things at once. She thought, as she had been thinking for 10 years, the words she would never say aloud, not because they weren't true, but because they were too true for any single occasion to hold. We were the best of what we could choose to be. For 160 years, we proved that a species born in blood can reach for something different and hold it. We were proud of that, and we were right to be. And then the galaxy showed us what happens when grace is taken for granted. We showed them what we were before we tried to be better. We showed them cleanly, without cruelty, with more restraint than anyone had any right to expect of us. And then we went back to the work of being healers, because that is who we chose to be. Not because we had no other option, but because we had every other option, and we chose this one. Perhaps that is what it means to be human, not one thing or the other, not the hand that heals or the hand that was raised to defend it, both, always both. And the grace is in the choosing, every single day, to reach for the better one.
She looked at the statue of Tomás Ferreira, kneeling in stone with a child in his arms and his other hand open and reaching towards something just beyond his reach. She looked at the Draavek child standing in the garden that had grown from graves. She placed her palm against the warm stone base of the statue and stood there in the amber light of a world still learning how to be alive again, while the new trees moved in the wind and birds sang songs that no one had heard on this world until people decided to bring them here and start over. The galaxy had wanted to know what humanity was. Now it knew. And knowing, it was, for the first time in a very long time, careful.